Right, our next speaker is BSBI's very own Dr. Pete Stroh, who is our scientific officer, has been there since 2012, working on a range of projects, including Plant Atlas 2020. And Peter's going to talk to us today about the GB Red List for vascular plants, on which he was lead author. The list was published last month as a special issue of British and Irish Botany, the BSBI's online scientific journal. So, Pete, over to you.
Thank you very much. Is there a flicky thing? Oh, there it is. Is the flick thing? Flick thing. Good. Hello. Just my luck to follow such a fascinating talk with talking about a list. Never mind. Well, you can all contemplate how old-fashioned a botanist I am. I'm certainly contemplating that now. As I talk you through, very briefly, the new vascular plant red list for Great Britain. And I'll just crack on. By first kind of talking you through, for those that don't know it, because sometimes when you work on a project for long enough, you assume everyone knows what you're talking about. So what is a red list? It's basically a measure of extinction risk using standardized criteria, and it's been adopted rather rapidly, actually, over the last 25 years or so by really globally. So it's the global standard now for measuring extinction risk, although extinction's rather a heavy term. If you look at how many species have gone extinct, plant species have gone extinct in Britain over the last 100 years, there's about 10, maybe 12. So I prefer to see it, although obviously Trevor was talking earlier, we're clearly not, we're trying to get there with Welsh groundsel, but we're not quite succeeding. But I prefer to think of it more as a health check on our wild flora. So see where we are. This applies just to natives and archaeophytes, by the way, not to neophytes. So this is, sorry, for those of you, everyone know what an archaeophyte is? I'm just assuming a lot of nodding heads there, but it's a species which was, shouldn't have started this. It's a species which was unintentionally introduced before 1500, is that right? I think that's right, more or less. Lots of arable weeds are basically archaeophytes. Anyway, so I see it more of a health check. The last red list was in 2005 for Britain. So we're looking at a gap of 20 years or so. Nice to see where we are now. It is a horribly rigorous process and is overseen by an independent IUCN assessor. And believe me when I say that they do assess, and they are very rigorous, because you have to conform to these standardized guidelines and criteria so that you can compare like with like across different regions and countries. So as I said, the last red list for Britain was published in 2005 using data from the first and second Atlas period, so that covers the 20th century basically. So they were woefully out of date, really, especially after the publication of the latest, the third Plant Atlas. So this uses, for the first time in Britain or Ireland, data from Plant Atlas 2020. So if you're wondering why you collected data for the Atlas, this is one of the reasons. So who's involved? Well, anyone that collected a botanical record and submitted them to the BSBI has been involved in this project, really. I'm going to ask for a show of hands just to try and engage the audience in this sort of post-prandial torpor that some of us are going through. So I imagine everyone here, is it just me who submitted a record to the BSBI? There you go, there's more like it. Crikey. And an extremely collaborative process when it came down to it. So we have all this data, these millions of records, and then we have a group called the Species Status Assessment Group. They've been around for about 25 years now, maybe 20 years. Some of the original founders are still with us. and there are some new members along the way too. And one of the people here, at least two of the people here today, are members of that group, Fred Rumsey and Mag's Cousins. Have I missed anyone out? Probably. So it's a group of about 10, 12 people covering different statutory agencies across Britain, and also Botanic Gardens, Natural History Museum, and willing, knowledgeable, independent experts. We were fortunate that this latest Red List was funded by Natural England in its entirety, so we're very grateful to Natural England, not so grateful to the other statutory agencies. And the process was led by, I'm only joking, the process was led by the BSBI, and as I say, we had this independent assessor who would go through our draft results and check them against the criteria, tell me how wrong we were, and then we go back to the beginning. So I'll just quickly talk you through the assessment process. So we have all this field data. We kind of decided that we needed to update some of the data, so we had the latest population counts for the really rare species, which unfortunately involved me going to the Cairngorms and other nice places, including the fens. That's a rare form of an early marsh orchid there, very nice habitat. So we've got all this data. Criterion D is mentioned there. There's several criteria. We don't need to worry about those. Then there was the analysis of the data, which was done by Oliver Pescott at UKCEH and Colin Harrow. Ollie did the main interrogation of the data to begin with, and we'd be lost without him. It's a partnership the BSBI's had with UKCEH, previously CEH, previously ITE, previously Nature Conservancy Council. We go on for a very long time. And we certainly could have done it on our own. So then you fit the results that we are given, which are churned out from the model. You fit them against the IUCN criteria. You kind of look at them and make sure they make sense. Sometimes they did. Often they did. Often they were pleasingly made sense, sensible. You'd have a discussion with the assessor about the results that you'd found and how you'd match them against the criteria. He would tell me how wrong I was, and then you'd repeat steps 3 to 6 until everything was hunky-dory. So including the write-up, this took about 2.5 years. So obviously I've aged a lot more than that over the last 2.5 years. I just wanted to talk you very briefly, I do say very briefly, but I also ramble on. So anyway, I'd like to talk very briefly about one challenge in particular, which came up in this Red List, and it's the criteria for generation length. The guidelines and criteria that IUCN produced were originally written for, I think they were African wild dogs, was the original method, the reason that the method was written up. Applying something originally written for mammals to plants is challenging to say the least. So one of the criteria which we measure threat against is trends in distribution. And it stipulates in the guidelines that you have to look at the trend within the last 10 years or 3 generations, whichever is the longest. That's fine for African wild dogs. It's not so fine for plants when one of the parameters we know the least about is lifespan. What is a generation? It's relatively straightforward for annuals like the blue pimpernel up there and the nice fumitory, because they are annuals. So you can fairly easily work out what a generational length is, although you have to bear in mind the seed bank longevity and the half-life of that. Anyway, so it's really quite tricky, is what I'm saying. And so we had to work out some kind of compromise. Initially, we weren't going to be allowed to compromise, but I suggest that we'd have to compromise. So there's a big old literature search, which is a lot of fun. And we ended up compromising by using 2 trend results. So we'd use a short-term trend for plants that had a relatively short lifespan, and we'd use a long-term trend for plants that had a relatively long lifespan. And it worked out, I mean, roughly similar. So you look at annuals versus trees, for example. The grey area was often these rhizomatous perennial species. So I put a photo of Caractalasia carpa up there. What is the generation length of an individual of one of those sedges? Who knows? Certainly the sedge referee did not know. So here's an example of how this affects the threat status of an individual species. Field gentian was assessed as vulnerable in the last GB Red List. Rightly so. It had declined massively throughout the 20th century, had a really diminished distribution by the turn of the 21st century. However, it's an annual, occasionally biennial species with a short-lived seed bank, and there was absolutely no way that we could assess this species under the IUCN criterion guidelines on a long-term trend. We had to use a short-term trend. And although it has still declined in the interim, under no criterion, I tried really hard, under no criteria did it qualify as threatened, so it's actually assessed as least concern. And I think one of the lessons to take away from this is, well, A, that nothing's perfect. No method is perfect, and certainly this doesn't work well for plants in some instances, but also that you shouldn't just assume that because a species is not threatened, it is of least concern, that it is not of conservation value. There's been several papers that have talked about the red list being the be-all and end-all. If you're threatened, you're in the club. If you're not, you're out. That's nonsense. I think we all know that. Lots of nationally rare and scarce species are not threatened. Lots of species which are wonderful indicators of good quality habitat are not threatened, rare or scarce. So you have to use common sense. And I'm not downplaying the importance of the red list, but I'm just saying you should use it in combination with other things, not in isolation. I go on. To Carex lamosa, which is a perennial rhizomatous sedge, probably very long-lived. This one was least concerned for the 2005 red list, which I found quite surprising, because it's definitely declined. It's always found in really vulnerable habitats, and lots of them were drained in the 20th century. So it was a surprise to me to see it as least concern, and a relief in a way to see that the decline metrics for this latest red list put it in the category of vulnerable, with a decline in extent of occupancy. So that's if you draw a line around the distribution, how much it's shrunk or expanded by. It's declined by 30%, more than that actually, with the majority of decline in lowland England. And that makes complete sense if you know anything about the species and its distribution. And the declines are linked to the usual things. And I think probably for lots of the species which have become threatened which weren't previously, it's probably something to do with the sensitivity model, which is much better than it was previously, but also continued loss since 2000. If you imagine that you only have to be considered present if you're one scrappy plant in one little tiny corner of a 10-kilometre square, you could be present for really quite a long period of time and sort of carry on existing just, and it only takes that one plant to go and all of a sudden it nosedives into decline. And if enough of that happens in a short amount of time, after long periods of sort of slow neglect and decline, then it kind of makes more sense to me. Have I had my 15 minutes yet? Oh God, sorry. Right, I'll run through these. So about a quarter of our wild flora is threatened in some way or another. That does not include lots of the apomix that we also assessed, of which there are about, I don't know, 600 or something like that. So it's the usual dire straits scenario. It's about the same figure as the 2005 red list. Different species are threatened in some instances. You know, it's not exactly the same. God, that would have been really disappointing if it was exactly the same. And it's the usual drivers of decline. Lowland areas are worst hit. There are some species which appear to have recovered in some respect, although I think that was in a large extent because of the trend that was used, as a kind of pessimistic view. A lot of the new threatened species were positive indicator species, and some increased threat was linked to climate change. We can make use of the red list in a number of ways. It enables us to see the bigger picture, which I think we should look at more often. Maybe look outside of Britain and see what we have and how it contributes to the bigger picture. These threat statuses will be used for SSI notification in the future and for prioritising species recovery work, etc. I think it's really important that, again, these shouldn't be seen in isolation. They should be seen as habitat-based. So for the example of field gentian, although it's not threatened, it'll be living in a habitat where there are lots of other threatened species. So in that effect, it'll benefit from better management, and it, I don't know, kicks the government up the arse, hopefully, but who knows if they'll read it. So you can find the red list. It's published you can download it for free using that link. It's British and Irish Botany. It's on the BSBI website, and you can, if you really want, you can have the PDF, which is a different design but the same content. You can download that from the BSBI website, unless you're a Vice County Recorder or a referee, in which case you can download it for free. The new threat statuses are in our database, so you can use them, and we plan to update the Plant Atlas website with them as soon as we are able to. And thank you very much for listening, and apologies for going on.
Thank you very much, Pete. That was great. Any questions for Pete? Oh, there's a couple. There's one just there and one just there.
Thank you. Pete, you haven't really mentioned the archaeophytes today, and that ties in with our previous speaker who was looking at biodiversity net gain. An arable field has zero biodiversity, so it can be developed. Would you like to say anything about the decline of archaeophytes?
Archaeophytes are declining. Next question. No, so, yeah, well, I mean, yes, I mean, archaeophytes are, if we look at just the arable species, you've got to see that they're all, I think almost all of them, possibly all of them are done on short-term trends because of their very nature. Most of them are annual. So you could see a reflection of, I'm not sure if this is answering a question, Jonathan, but some species which used to have a higher threat status have a reduced threat status in the past 20 odd years, and that could reflect better management, better understanding of the habitat requirements for those species. They haven't declined as much as they did in the past, and then others have gone through the floor, and so it'd be an interesting thing to analyse in more detail the archaeophytes, and especially their traits and their association with soil and fertility, and see if we come up with anything of interest.
I am going to move it along. I'm really sorry.
Just like to talk a bit more about archaeophytes.